Chapter 9. I shall not bore you with repetition. My second year was pretty much like my first, with the same finale. Ditto for the third. Ryan came twice that second year with a basket of goodies and a mouthful of gossip. Both times I forbade him ever to come again. The third year he came down 6 times, every other month. And each time I forbade him anew and ate his food and heard what he had to say. Something was wrong in Amber. Strange things walked through shadow and presented themselves, with violence, to all and sundry. They were destroyed, of course. Eric was still trying to figure out how they had occurred. I did not mention my curse, though I later rejoiced in the fact that it had come to pass. Random, like myself, was still prisoner. His wife had joined him. The positions of my other brothers and sisters remained unchanged. This bolstered me through the third anniversary of the coronation, and it made me feel almost alive again. One day, it was there, and it made me feel so good that I immediately broke out the final bottle of wine that Ryan had brought me and opened the last pack of cigarettes, which I had been saving. I smoked them and sipped and enjoyed the feeling that I had somehow beaten Eric. If he found this out, I felt it might be fatal. But I knew he didn't know, so I rejoiced, smoking, drinking, and reveling in the light of that which had occurred. Yes, the light. I discovered a tiny patch of brightness, off somewhere to my right. Well, let's take it like this. I'd awakened in a hospital bed and learned that I had recovered all too soon. Dig? I heal faster than others who had been broken. All the lords and ladies of Amber have something to this capacity. I'd lived through the plague. I'd lived through the march on Moscow. I regenerate faster and better than anybody I've ever known. Napoleon had once made a remark about it. So had General MacArthur. With nerve tissue, it takes me a bit longer. That's all. My sight was returning to me, and that's what it meant. That lovely patch of brightness off somewhere to my right. After a time... Oh, you know what? I think I might be reading a little bit too close to the mic here. Sorry about that. I'm trying to make it a little bit louder for YouTube, but I might have cranked it a little bit too much. After a time, I knew that it was the little barren era... I knew that it was the little barren area and the door to my cell. I'd grown new eyes, my fingers told me. It had taken me over 3 years, but I'd done it. It was the 1 in a million thing I spoke of earlier, the thing which even Eric could not properly assess because of the variances of powers among the individual members of the family. I had beaten him to this extent. I had learned that I could grow new eyeballs. I'd always known that I could regenerate nerve tissues given sufficient time. I'd been left paraplegic from a spine injury received during the Franco-Prussian Wars. After 2 years, it had gone away. I had had my hope, a wild one, I'll admit, that I could do what I'd done then with my burned-out orbs. And I'd been right. They felt intact. And the sight was returning, slowly. How long till the next anniversary of Eric's coronation? I stopped pacing and my heart beat faster. As soon as someone saw that I'd recovered my eyes, I'd lose them again. Therefore, I'd have to escape before the 4 years had passed. How? I hadn't thought about it much up to this time, because even if I could figure a way to get out of my cell, I'd never make it out of Amber. Or out of the palace, for that matter, without eyes or aid, and neither were available to me. Now, though, the door of my cell was a big, heavy, brass-bound thing, with only a tiny grill at a height of about 5 feet for purposes of looking in to see whether I was still alive, if anyone cared. Even if I succeeded in removing it, I could tell that I couldn't reach out far enough to touch the lock. There was a little swinging gate at the bottom of the door, large enough to push my food through, and that's about all. The hinges were either on the outside or in between the door and the jamb, and I couldn't tell for sure. Either way, I couldn't get at them. There were no windows and no other doors. It was still almost like being blind, save for that feeble, reassuring light through the grill. I knew my sight hadn't returned fully. That was still a long way off, but even if it had, it was nearly pitch dark in there. I knew this because I knew the dungeons under Amber. I lit a cigarette, paced some more, and assessed my possessions, seeking anything that might be of aid. There was my clothing, my sleeping mat, and all of the damp straw I wanted. I also had matches, but I quickly rejected the notion of setting fire to the straw. I doubted anyone would come and open the door if I did. Most likely the guard would come and laugh if he came at all. I had a spoon I'd picked up at the last banquet. I'd wanted a knife, really, but Julian had caught me trying to lift one and snatched it away. What he didn't know, though, was that was my second attempt. I already had the spoon tucked inside my boot. So what good was it? I'd heard those stories of guys digging their way out of cells with the damnedest things. Belt buckles, which I didn't have, etc. But I didn't have time to try the Count of Monte Cristo bit. I needed out in a matter of months, or my new eyes would mean nothing. The door was mainly wood, oak. It was bound with 4 metal strips. One went around it near the top, one near the bottom, right above the gate, and there were 2 which ran top to bottom, passing along either side of the foot-wide grill. The door opened outward, I knew, and the lock was to my left. My memories told me the door was about 2 inches thick, and I recalled the approximate position of the lock, which I verified by leaning against the door and feeling the tension at that point. I knew that the door was also barred, but I could worry about that later. I might be able to raise it by sliding the handle of the spoon upward between the door's edge and the jamb. I knelt on my sleeping mat, and with the spoon I traced a box about that area which contained the lock. I worked until my hand was quite sore, maybe a couple of hours. Then I ran my fingernail over the surface of the wood. I hadn't scarred it much, but it was a beginning. I switched the spoon to my left hand and continued until it began to ache. I kept hoping that Ryan would show up. I was sure I could talk him into giving me his dagger if I really pressed the matter. He didn't put in an appearance, though, so I just kept grinding away. Day after day I worked, until I was perhaps half an inch into the wood. Each time I'd hear a guard's footsteps, I'd move the pallet back to the far wall and lie down on it with my back to the door. When he had passed, I'd resume work. Then I had to stop for a while, much as I hated to. Even though I'd wrapped them in cloth torn from my garments, my hands had blistered and the blisters had broken. And after a time, the raw flesh underneath began to bleed. So I took a break to let them heal. I decided to devote the time to planning what I'd do after I got out. When I'd worked my way far enough through the door, I'd raise the bar. The sound of it falling would probably bring a guard. By then, though, I'd be out. A couple of good kicks would break out the piece I was working on, and the lock could stay right where it was if it wanted to. The door would swing open then, and I would face the guard. He would be armed, and I wouldn't. I'd have to take him. He might be overconfident, thinking I couldn't see. On the other hand, he might be a bit afraid if he recalled how I'd entered into Amber. Either way, he would die, and I would then be armed. I gripped my right biceps with my left hand and my fingertips touched. Gods, I was emaciated. Whatever, I was the blood of Amber, and I felt that even in my condition I could take on any ordinary man. Maybe I was kidding myself, but I'd have to try it. Then if I succeeded, with a blade in my hand, nothing could keep me from reaching the pattern. I'd walk it, and when I made it to the center, I could transport myself to any shadow world I chose. There I would recuperate, and this time I would not rush things. If it took me a century, I'd have everything letter perfect before I moved against Amber again. After all, I was technically its liege. Hadn't I crowned myself in the presence of all before Eric had done the same? I'd make good my claim to the throne. If only it weren't impossible to walk into shadow from Amber itself. Then I wouldn't have to fool around with the pattern. But my Amber is the center of all, and you just don't depart it that easily. After, say, a month, my hands had healed, and I was developing large calluses from my scraping activities. I heard a guard's footsteps and removed myself to the far side of the cell. There was a brief creak, and my meal was slipped through the door. Then there were footsteps again, this time diminishing into the distance. I returned to the door. Without looking, I knew it was on the tray. A chunk of stale bread, a crock of water, and a piece of cheese if I was lucky. I positioned the mat, knelt on it, and felt at the groove. I was about halfway through. Then I heard the chuckle. It came from behind me. I turned, not needing my eyes to tell me that someone else was present. There was a man standing near the left wall, giggling. "Who is it?" I said, and my voice sounded strange. I realized then that these were the first words I had spoken in a long while. "Escape," he said, "trying to escape." And he chuckled again. "How did you get in here?" "Walked," he replied. "From where? How?" I struck a match and it hurt my eyes, but I held it. He was a small man. Tiny might be an even better word. He was around 5 feet tall and a hunchback. His hair and beard were as heavy as my own. The only distinguishing features in that great mass of fur were his long, hook nose and his almost black eyes, now squinted against the light. "Dworkin," I said. He chuckled again. "That's my name. What's yours?" "Don't you know me, Dworkin?" I struck another match and held it near my face. "Look hard. Forget the beard and all the hair. Add 100 pounds to my frame. You drew me, in exquisite detail, on several packs of playing cards." "Corwin," he said at last. "I remember you, yes." "I'd thought you dead." "I'm not, though. See?" And he pirouetted before me. "How is your father? Have you seen him recently? Did he put you here?" "Oberon is no more," I replied. "My brother Eric reigns in Amber, and I am his prisoner." "Then I have seniority," he told me, "for I am Oberon's prisoner." "Oh? None of us knew that Dad had locked you up." I heard him weeping. "Yes," he said after a time. "He didn't trust me." "Why not?" "I told him I'd thought of a way to destroy Amber. I described it to him, and he locked me in." "That wasn't very nice," I said. "I know," he agreed, "but he did give me a pretty apartment and lots of things to do research with. Only he stopped coming to visit me after a time. He used to bring men who showed me splotches of ink and made me tell stories about them. That was fun, until I told a story I didn't like and turned the man into a frog. The king was angry when I wouldn't turn him back, and it's been so long since I've seen anybody that I'd turn him back now. If he wanted me to, still, once." "How did you get here, into my cell?" I asked again. "I told you, I walked." "Through the wall?" "Of course not. Through the shadow wall." "No man can walk through shadows in Amber. There were no shadows in Amber." "Well, I cheated," he admitted. "How?" "I designed a new trump and stepped through it to see what was on the other side of this wall. Oh my, I just remembered. I can't get back without it. I'll have to make another. Have you got anything to eat and something to draw with? And something to draw on?" "Have a piece of bread," I said, and handed it to him. "And here's a piece of cheese to go along with it."
"Thank you, Corwin."
And he wolfed them down and drank all my water afterward.
"Now, if you'll give me a pen and a piece of parchment, I'll be returning to my own rooms. I want to finish a book I've been reading. It's been nice talking to you. Too bad about Eric. I'll stop back again sometime and we'll talk some more. If you see your father, please tell him not to be angry with me because
"I don't have a pen or parchment," I observed.
"Goodness," he said, "that's hardly civilized."
"I know, but then, Eric isn't very."
"Well, what have you got? I prefer my own apartment to this place. At least, it's better lighted."
"You have dined with me," I said, "and now I'm going to ask you a favor. If you will grant me this request, I promise that I will do everything I can to make things right between you and Dad."
"What is it that you want?" he asked.
"Long have I admired your work," I said, "and there is something I have always desired as a work of your hand. Do you recall the lighthouse of Cabra?"
Of course, I've been there many times. I know the keeper, Jopin. I used to play chess with him.
More than anything else I can think of, I told him. For most of my adult life, I have longed to see one of your magical sketches of that great gray tower.
A very simple subject, he said, and rather an appealing one at that. I did some preliminary sketches in the past, but I never got beyond that point. Other work kept getting in the way. I'll fetch you one if you like.
No, I said. I'd like something more enduring to keep me company here in my cell, to comfort me and any others who may later occupy this place.
Commendable, he said. What have you in mind as the medium?
I have a stylus here, I told him. The spoon was fairly sharp by then. I'd like to see it traced upon the far wall, so that I might look at it as I take my rest. He was silent a moment, then,
The illumination is quite poor, he remarked.
I have several books of matches, I replied. I'll light them and hold them for you. We might even burn some of this straw if we run low.
Those are hardly ideal working conditions.
I know, I said, and I apologize for them, great Dworkin. But they are the best I have to offer. A work of art by your hand would brighten my humble existence beyond measure. He chuckled again.
Very well. But you must promise me that you will provide light afterwards so that I may sketch myself a way back to my own chambers.
Agreed, I said, and I felt in my pocket. I had 3 full packages of matches and part of a 4th. I pressed the spoon into his hand and led him to the wall. Do you have the feel of the instrument? I asked him.
Yes, it's a sharpened spoon, isn't it?
Yes. I'll make a light as soon as you say you are ready. You'll have to sketch rapidly because my supply of matches is limited. I'll allot half for the lighthouse and half for your own business.
All right, he said,
and I struck a match, and he began to trace lines upon the moist gray wall. First, he did an upright rectangle to frame and contain the thing. Then, with several deft strokes, the lighthouse began to appear. It was amazing. Daft as he was, his skill was intact. I held each match to its barest base, spat on my left thumb and forefinger, and when I could hold it no longer in my right, I took hold of the blackened end and inverted it, letting the match burn away completely before I struck another. When the first book of matches was gone, he had finished the tower and was working on the sea and the sky. I encouraged him. I murmured appreciation at every stroke. Great, really great, I said when it appeared to be almost finished. Then he made me waste another match while he signed it. It was almost through the second book by then.
Now let's admire it, he said.
If you want to get back to your own apartments, you'll have to leave the admiring to me, I told him. We're too low on matches to be art critics at this point. He pouted a bit, but moved to the other wall and began sketching as soon as I struck a light. He sketched a tiny study, a skull on the desk, a globe beside it, walls full of books all around.
Now that's good, he said,
when I finished the 3rd pack and was starting on the final remaining partial pack. It took him 6 more to finish up and 1 to sign it. He gazed at it while the 8th match burned. Then there were only 2 remaining. Then he took a step forward and he was gone. The match was burning my fingertips by then, and I dropped it, and it sizzled when it hit the straw and went out. I stood there shaking, full of mixed feelings. And then I heard his voice and felt his presence at my side. He was back again.
I just thought of something, he said. How can you see the picture when it's so dark in here?
Oh, I can see in the dark, I told him. I've lived with it so long that it has become my friend.
I see. I just wondered. Give me a light so I can go back now.
Very well, I agreed, considering my second-to-last match. But you'd better bring your own illumination next time you stop around. I'll be out of matches after this.
All right.
And I struck a light, and he considered his drawing, walked toward it, and vanished once more. I turned quickly and considered the lighthouse of Cabra before the match failed. Yes, the power was there. I could feel it. Would my final match serve me, though? No, I didn't think it would. A longer period of concentration than that was required for me to use a trump as a gateway. What could I burn? The straw was too damp and might not take fire. It would be horrible to have the gateway, my road to freedom, right there with me and not be able to use it. I needed a flame that would last a while. My sleeping roll. It was a cloth liner stuffed with straw. That straw would be drier, and the cloth would burn too. I cleared half the floor, down to the bare stone. Then I sought the sharpened spoon to use to cut the liner. I cursed then. Dworkin had carried it off with him. I twisted and tore at the thing. Finally, it came open, and I pulled out the dry straw from the middle. I made a little heap of it, and I set the liner nearby to use as extra fuel if I needed it. The less smoke, the better, though. It would attract attention if a guard passed this way. This wasn't too likely, though, since I had just recently been fed, and I got 1 meal a day. I struck my last match, then used it to set fire to the cardboard book that had continued it. When this got going, I used it on the straw. It almost didn't take. The straw was damper than I'd thought, even though it came from the center of my mat. But finally, there was a glow, and then a flame. It took 2 of the other empty matchbooks to achieve this, so I was glad I hadn't thrown them down the john. I tossed on the third, held the liner in my left hand, and stood and faced the drawing. The glow spread up the wall as the flames danced higher, and I concentrated on the tower and recalled it. I thought I heard the cry of a gull. I sniffed something like a salt breeze, and the place became more real as I stared. I tossed the liner into the fire, and the flames subsided for a moment, then sprang higher. I didn't remove my eyes from the drawing as I did this. The magic was still there, in Dworkin's hand, for soon the lighthouse seemed as real to me as my cell. Then it seemed the only reality, and the cell but a shadow at my back. I heard the splashing of the waves and felt something like the afternoon sun upon me. I stepped forward, but my foot did not descend into the fire. I stood upon the sandy, rock-strewn edge of the small island Cabra, which held the great gray lighthouse that lit a path for the ships of amber by night. A flock of frightened gulls wheeled and screamed about me, and my laughter was one with the booming of the surf and the free song of the wind. Amber lay 43 miles behind my left shoulder. I'd escaped. Chapter 10. I made my way to the lighthouse and climbed the stone stair that led to the door on its western face. It was high, wide, heavy, and watertight. Also, it was locked. There was a small quay about 300 yards behind me. 2 boats were moored at it. One was a rowboat, and the other was a sailboat with a cabin. They swayed gently, and beneath the sun the water was mica behind them. I paused for a moment to regard them. It had been so long since I had seen anything that for an instant they seemed more than real, and I caught a sob within my throat and swallowed it. I turned and knocked on the door. After what seemed too long a wait, I knocked again. Finally, I heard a noise within, and the door swung open, creaking on its 3 dark hinges. Jopin, the keeper, regarded me through bloodshot eyes, and I smelled whiskey upon his breath. He was about 5.5 feet tall, and so stooped that he reminded me somewhat of Dworkin. His beard was as long as mine, so of course it seemed longer, and it was the color of smoke, save for a few yellow stains near his dry-looking lips. His skin was as porous as an orange rind, and the elements had darkened it to resemble a fine old piece of furniture. His dark eyes squinted, focused. As with many people who are hard of hearing, he spoke rather loudly. "Who are you? What do you want?" he asked. If I was that unrecognizable in my emaciated, hairy condition, I decided that I might as well maintain my anonymity. "I'm a traveler from the south, and I was shipwrecked recently," I said. "I clung to a piece of wood for many days and was finally washed ashore here. I slept on the beach all morning. It was only recently that I recovered sufficient strength to walk to your lighthouse." He moved forward and took my arm. He threw his other arm around my shoulders. Come in then," he said. "Lean on me. Take it easy. Come this way." He led me to his quarters, which were extraordinarily messy, being strewn with many old books, charts, maps, and pieces of nautical equipment. He wasn't any too steady himself, so I didn't lean too hard, just enough to maintain the impression of weakness I had tried to convey as I leaned against his doorframe. He led me to a daybed, suggested I lie down, and left to secure the door and fetch me something to eat. I removed my boots, but my feet were so filthy that I've put them back on again. If I'd been drifting about very long, I wouldn't be dirty. I didn't want to give away my story, so I drew a blanket that was there over me and leaned back, really resting. Jopin returned shortly with a pitcher of water, a pitcher of beer, a great slice of beef, and half a loaf of bread upon a square wooden tray. He swept clear the top of a small table, which he then kicked into a position beside the couch. Then he set the tray down on it and bade me eat and drink. I did. I stuffed myself. I glutted myself. I ate everything in sight. I emptied both pitchers. Then I felt tremendously tired. Jopin nodded when he saw it come over me, and he told me to go to sleep. Before I knew it, I had. When I awakened, it was night time, and I felt considerably better than I had in many weeks. I got to my feet and retraced my earlier route and departed the building. It was chilly out there, but the sky was crystal clear and there seemed to be a million stars. The lens at the top of the tower blazed at my back, then went dark, blazed, then went dark. The water was cold, but I just had to cleanse myself. I bathed and washed my clothing and wrung it out. I must have spent an hour doing that. Then I went back to the lighthouse, hung my clothing over the back of an old chair to dry out, crawled beneath the blanket, slept again. In the morning, when I awoke, Jopin was already up. He prepared me a hearty breakfast, and I treated it the same way as I had the dinner of the night previous evening. Then I borrowed a razor, a mirror, and a pair of scissors, and gave myself a shave and a sort of haircut. I bathed again afterward, and when I donned my salty, stiff, clean garments, I felt almost human again. Jopin stared at me when I returned from the sea and said, "You look kind of familiar, fella." And I shrugged. "Now, tell me about your wreck." So I did, out of whole cloth. What a disaster I detailed, down to the snapping of the mainmast yet. He patted me on the shoulder and poured me a drink. He lit the cigar he had given me. "You just rest easy there," he told me. "I'll take you ashore any time you like, or I'll signal you a passing ship if you see one you recognize." I'm sorry, I keep changing his voice. I took him up on his offered hospitality. It was too much of a lifesaver not to. I ate his food and drank his drinks and let him give me a clean shirt, which was too big for him. It had belonged to a friend of his who drowned at sea. I stayed with him for 3 months as I recovered my strength. I helped him around the place, tending the light on nights when he felt like getting smashed, and cleaning up all the rooms in the house, even to the extent of painting 2 of them and replacing 5 cracked window panes, and watching the sea with him on stormy nights. He was apolitical, I learned. He didn't care who reigned in Amber. So far as he was concerned, the whole bloody crew of us were rotten. So long as he could tend his lighthouse and eat and drink good food and brew, and consider his nautical charts in peace, he didn't give half a damn what happened ashore. I came to be rather fond of him, and since I knew something of old charts and maps also, we spent many a good evening correcting a few. I had sailed far into the north many years ago, and I gave him a new chart based on my recollections of the voyage. This seemed to please him immensely, as did my description of those waters. "Corey," that was how I'd named myself, "I'd like to sail with you one day," he said. "I hadn't realized you were a skipper of your own vessel one time." "Who knows?" I told him. "You were once a captain yourself, weren't you?" "How'd you know?" he asked. Actually, I'd remembered, but I gestured about me in reply. "All these things you've collected," I said, "and your fondness for the charts. Also, you bear yourself like a man who once held a command." He smiled. "Yes," he told me, "that's true. I had a command for over 100 years. That seems long ago. Let's have another drink." I sipped mine and sort of put it aside. I must have gained over 40 pounds in the months I'd spent with him. Any day now I was expecting him to recognize me as a member of my family. Maybe he would turn me into Eric if he did, and maybe not. Now that we'd established this much of a camaraderie, I had a feeling that he might not do it. I didn't want to take the chance and find out, though. Sometimes, as I sat tending the light, I wondered, how long should I stay here? Not too much longer, I decided, adding a drop of grease to a swivel bearing. Not much longer at all. The time was drawing near when I should take to the road and walk among shadows once again. Then one day I felt the pressure, gentle and questing at first. I couldn't tell for sure who it was. I immediately stood stock still, closed my eyes, and made my mind go blank. It was about 5 minutes before the questing presence withdrew. I paced then and wondered, and I smiled when I realized the shortness of my course. Unconsciously, I had been pacing out the dimensions of my cell back in Amber. Someone had just tried to reach me via my trump. Was it Eric? Had he finally become aware of my absence and decided to try locating me in this manner? I wasn't sure. I felt that he might fear mental contact with me again. Julian, then? Or Gerard? Kane? Whoever it had been, I had closed him out completely, I knew that. And I would refuse any such contact with any of my family. I might be missing some important news or a helpful call, but I couldn't afford to take the chance. The attempted contact and my blocking efforts left me with a chill. I shuddered. I thought about the thing all the rest of the day and decided that time had come for me to move on. It wouldn't do for me to remain this close to Amber while I was so vulnerable. I had recovered sufficiently to make my way among shadows, to seek for the place where I had to go to if Amber were to ever be mine. I'd been lulled into something close to peace by old Jopin's ministrations. It would be a pain to leave him, for in the months of our association I had come to like the old guy. So that evening, after we'd finished a game of chess, I told him of my plans to depart. He poured us 2 drinks, then raised his and said, "Good luck to ye, Corwin. I hope to see ye again someday." I didn't question the fact that he'd called me by my proper name, and he smiled as he realized that I hadn't let it slip by. "You've been all right, Jopin," I told him. "If I should succeed in what I'm about to try, I won't forget what you did for me." He shook his head. "Nah, I don't want anything," he said. "I'm happy right where I am, doing exactly what I'm doing. I enjoy running this damned tower. It's my whole life. If you should succeed in whatever you're about... No, don't tell me about it, please. I don't want to know. I'll be hoping you stop by for a game of chess sometime." "I will," I promised. "You can take the butterfly in the morning if you'd like." "Thanks." The butterfly was a sailboat. "Before you go," he said, "I suggest you take my spyglass, climb the tower, and look back on the Vale of Garnath." "What's there to see?" He shrugged. "You'll have to make your own mind up about that." I nodded. "Okay, I will." We then proceeded to get pleasantly high and turned in for the night. I'd miss old Jopin. With the exception of Ryan, he was the only friend I'd found since my return. I wondered vaguely about the valley which had been a sheet of flame the last time I had crossed it. What could it be that was so unusual about it now, these 4 years later? Troubled by dreams of werewolves and sabbats, I slept, and the full moon rose above the world. At the crack of dawn, I did the same. Jopin was still sleeping, which was good because I don't really like to say goodbye, and I had a funny feeling that I would never see him again. I climbed the tower to the room that had housed the big light, spyglass at my side. I moved to the window facing the shore and focused on the valley. There was a mist hanging above the wood. It was a cold, gray, wet-looking thing that clung to the tops of the small, gnarly trees. The trees were dark, and their branches twisted together like the fingers of wrestling hands. Dark things darted among them, and from the patterns of their flight I knew they were not birds. Bats, probably. There was something evil present in that great wood, I knew, and then I recognized it. It was myself. I had done this thing with my curse. I had transformed the peaceful valley of Garnath into what it now represented. It was my symbol of my hate for Eric, and all those others who stood by and let him get away with his power grab, let him blind me. I didn't like the looks of that forest. And as I stared at it, I realized how my hate had objectified itself. I knew it because it was a part of me. I had created a new entranceway into the real world. Garnath was now a pathway through shadows, shadows dark and grim. Only the dangerous, the malicious, might walk that pathway. This was the source of the things Ryan had mentioned, the things that troubled Eric. Good, in a way, if they kept him occupied. But as I swung the glass, I couldn't escape the feeling that I had done a very bad thing indeed. At the time, I had no idea that I'd ever see the light of day's bright skies again. Now that I did, I realized what I'd unleashed. And I'd unleashed a thing that would take an awful lot of undoing. Even now, strange shapes seemed to move within that place. I'd done a thing which had never been done before. Not during the whole of Oberon's reign. I had opened a new way to Amber. And I had opened it only to the worst. A day would come when the Liege of Amber, whoever he might be, would be faced with the problem of closing that dreadful way. I knew this as I stared, realizing the thing to be a product of my own pain, anger, and hate. If I won out in Amber one day, I might have to cope with my own handiwork, which is always a devilish thing to accept. I lowered the glass and sighed. So be it, I decided. In the meantime, it would give Eric something to have insomnia over. I grabbed a quick bite to eat, outfitted the butterfly as rapidly as I could, hoisted some canvas, cast off, and set sail. Jopin was usually up by that hour, but maybe he didn't like goodbyes either. I headed her out to sea, knowing where I was going, but not real certain how to get there. I'd be sailing through shadow and strange waters, but it would be better than the overland route, what with my handiwork abroad in the realm. I had set sail for a land near as sparkling as amber itself, an almost immortal place, a place that did not really exist, not any longer. It was a place which had vanished into chaos ages ago, but of which a shadow must somewhere survive. All I had to do was find it, recognize it, and make it mine once again, as it had been in days long gone by. Then, with my own forces to back me up, I would do another thing Amber had never known. I didn't know how yet, but I promised myself that guns would blaze within the immortal city on the day of my return. As I sailed into shadow, a white bird of my desire came and sat upon my right shoulder, and I wrote a note and tied it to its leg and sent it on its way. The note said, "I am coming," and it was signed by me. I would never rest until I held vengeance and the throne within my hand, and good night, sweet prince, to anybody who stood between me and these things. The sun hung low on my left, and winds bellied the sails and propelled me onward. I cursed once and then laughed. I was free and I was running, but I had made it this far. I now had the chance I'd wanted all along. A blackbird of my desire came and sat on my left shoulder. And I wrote a note and tied it to its leg and sent it off into the west. It said, "Eric, I'll be back." And it was signed Corwin, Lord of Amber. A demon wind propelled me east of the sun. And that is the end of 9 Princes in Amber by Roger Zelazny. Alright, I told you guys I'd try to put out more regular videos, so y'all should be frothing at the mouth over this one. Because that means we get to start Guns of Avalon next time. So look forward to that one. Guns of Avalon, I think, as a whole, the series gets a lot more interesting from here on out. You get a lot more stuff going on. Guns of Avalon in particular is up there with Courts of Chaos for my favorite title in the series. For the Corwin cycle, anyways. Merlin cycle is really good. The thing about the Merlin cycle is that I never keep all the books straight in the Merlin cycle. I just, read through them so quickly every time. But I think that'll be it for this time. I'll try not to ramble on too long at the end of this one. So I'll see you guys next time.